Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
How did Fidel Castro come into power? Throughout his life, Cuban leader Fidel Castro has been a figure of controversy. Many people hail him as the one true socialist leader who liberated his country from the exploitation by American companies, gambling, and prostitution run by the mafia, as well as the oppression of right-wing military dictator President Fulgencio Batista. Others condemn Castro as a merciless dictator who is bent solely on achieving power for its own sake, and who has simply used the cloak of socialism to legitimize his regime. People tend to take one of these extreme viewpoints, and far too often any discussion on Fidel Castro turns into a politically loaded or even emotionally loaded exchange of arguments. It is not like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, whom most people in the world accept as being bad. Fidel Castro has done both good and bad things, and he is so controversial that it can be risky even to attempt presenting an image of the man and his role in history, because you cannot know how others might feel about this. With that in mind, we will begin exploring how Castro came to be the leader maximo, the greatest leader, of the small island nation of Cuba. We will focus on the time from about 1945, when Castro became a politically active law student at Havana University, to 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis. When investigating Castro's way into power, it becomes clear that he made use of both democratic, revolutionary, and legalistic means in order to obtain his position. It is also clear that Castro is known for having amazing abilities as a speaker to woo and control large crowds, and that it is a keystone to his political force. Finally, it took a long time for the world, and perhaps Castro himself, to directly identify him with a political ideology. Should we compare these traits to any other single-party state leader, the candidate is quite surprising. The one candidate who fit all of the above-mentioned traits is none other than Third Reich Führer Adolf Hitler. Hitler went from revolutionary to democratic to legalistic methods in obtaining power, whereas Castro went from democratic to revolutionary to legalistic methods. But keep in mind that although we might discover similarities in the steps towards political power, this is by no means an identification of a similarity in political ideology, worldview, or psychology of these two leaders. The crass terror of National Socialist Germany with its death camps, racial hatred, and extermination of the Jews is a far cry from the notion of Castro's socialist Cuba with free education and healthcare, as well as Castro's own image as anti-imperialist guerrilla soldier. Nevertheless, both leaders showed an ability to make use of both democratic, revolutionary, and legalistic means on their way towards claiming total control over their respective countries. As a young man, Fidel Castro had democratic leanings. They came about towards the end of his time at Havana University in 1945 to 1950. It presents a mixed image of Castro. Some focus on Castro's vice presidency of the law school and his membership of the anti-corruption Orthodoxo Party. Others claim that Castro was a member of the political gang Unión Insurreccional Revolucionaria, or UIR, for which he killed Leonel Gómez, junior leader of a rival political gang. Castro joined Havana University as a law student in 1945 when he was 20 years old. Havana University was a haven for political gangs. The law stated that no one could be persecuted on university campus regardless of political beliefs. many student gangs fought each other on university grounds. But in 1947, Castro joined the political party Ortodoxo, which campaigned against state corruption, and in 1952 he decided to run for election to the Cuban parliament as Havana's Ortodoxo candidate. But just before the election, former President General Fulgencio Batista instigated a coup d'etat and proclaimed himself president again. Under his leadership, or dictatorship, thousands of Cubans were imprisoned, tortured, or executed for critique of the government and revolutionary activities. Batista allowed American companies extensive rights over large parts of Cuba, and especially fruit and sugar plantations were run by American businessmen. The American mafia made Havana a haven for gambling and prostitution. As we can see, Castro definitely did try to gain power by democratic means. There are, however, doubts about his political motivation and ideology. Castro himself later told an American journalist, Lesnick, that having always been a revolutionary at heart, he actually wanted to enter parliament in order to use it to create a revolutionary platform for the underclass of Cuba. In this respect, he resembles Hitler, who also wanted to use democracy in order to crush it. Only Castro was democratic before he was revolutionary, whereas for Hitler it was the opposite. Fidel Castro's shift from democratic politician to revolutionary guerrilla fighter came in 1952 when Batista had seized power. Immediately after Batista's seizure of power, Castro began organizing a revolutionary movement. Working as a lawyer in the daytime, his nights were spent conspiring against Batista. Castro had an extraordinary ability to draw people to him and a charisma which gave him many followers. As with other charismatic leaders, Castro would demonstrate an extraordinary ability as a speaker, leading the audience towards feverishly agreeing with his proposals. This continued after his entrance into power, laying the foundation for what he called direct democracy. He did read the works of Lenin, but what he taught his followers was a homemade doctrine of Cuban independence, autonomy, and continuous revolution. By the time Fidel was 26, he had 1,200 members of the movement, as it was called. The first attempt at revolution was in July 1953, when Fidel Castro, together with between 87 and 165 fellow Fidelistas, tried to take over the Moncada military barracks in Santiago. It did not work, and the surprise attack was discovered even before it had really started. It was this failed attempt at revolution and subsequent trial which most of all bears a striking resemblance to Hitler's early grasp for power. After the failed Munich beer hall putsch of 1923, Hitler chose to represent himself in court, where he stated that history acquits us, of treason that is. Like Hitler, Castro managed to turn the courtroom into a political stage and claimed that history will absolve me. But Castro went even further by announcing a 5-point political manifesto in court and thus directly presenting his political program in the courtroom. Castro might later have become absolved by history, but he was still sentenced to 15 years in prison in the Bonato prison on the Isle of Pines. Only 2 years later, Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and other Fidelistas were released in exchange for Batista gaining more supportive seats in parliament. This became the beginning of Castro's second revolutionary period. For the next few years, Castro stayed in exile in Mexico, planning to return to Cuba, leading a final revolution. During this time, he met Che Guevara, a young, handsome Argentinian doctor. Che Guevara was convinced that all of Latin America's problems were rooted in the old Latin American aristocracy and the economic and political dominance of the continent by the United States of America. The plan was for a boat landing of revolutionary soldiers in the Oriente province of Cuba. Led by Fidel, the forces would cut off Oriente from the rest of Cuba and gradually take control over liberated areas. A diversionary attack was to be made in the city of Santiago, led by fellow revolutionary Frank País. But Castro's boat was 2 days late. By then, País's men had died in street fighting, and Batista was waiting for Castro's arrival. Escaping Batista's soldiers, Fidel Castro and a handful of followers fled to the Sierra Mountains. For the next 2 years, these mountains became their base. Fidel Castro would collect and train guerrilla soldiers, while his brother Raúl would open a second attack front in Oriente. Fidel also met with several foreign journalists who spread the word of his impending liberation, a Cuban revolution, to the rest of the world. From March to December 1958, Raúl Castro led many guerrilla victories against Batista's superior forces. With small bands of guerrilla fighters, Raúl Castro employed hit-and-run attacks on Batista's military installations. The tactic was very successful, and Raúl was careful not to harm the civilian population so as not to push them away. 160 of Raúl's men died, while 1,979 Batista soldiers were killed. All the while, the idea of a Cuban revolution became all the more apparent in society, and Batista found himself more and more without a power base. On New Year's Eve 1959, at 2 a.m. in the morning, Batista fled Cuba with a large sum of money. Immediately, Castro set out for the city of Santiago, which he entered triumphantly on January 2nd, 1959. The people flocked around the Fidelista guerrillas in glorious mass assemblies, cheering for Fidel. The revolution had been accomplished, and Castro was now in power over Cuba. As we can see, Castro carried out 2 revolutions separated by a court trial and prison sentence. During his trial, he demonstrated a remarkable similarity to Adolf Hitler in that he also chose to act as his own attorney and remarked that history would make the proper judgment and absolve him. Like Hitler, Castro turned the courtroom into a political podium, using the attention of the press to spread his ideas. A somewhat loose political program was laid out. Now, it is highly unlikely that Castro intended any comparison to Hitler, and no regime on earth, least the Castro regime, can be considered similar to the brutal, race-based evil of the Third Reich. But being well educated, it is likely that Castro knew the history of Hitler's success in the courtroom. Whether he deliberately chose to make use of the same technique is, however, up to each of us to decide for ourselves. Having gotten the power over Cuba, Castro began introducing legalistic measures to transform Cuba and consolidate his power. In this, he followed both traditional methods of single-party state leaders, namely making his opponents illegal, and communist methods of both land reform and a tactic similar to the so-called salami tactics used by communists in Eastern Europe. In the end, Castro was at the head of all important political offices. First, Castro grafted some new laws onto the existing Cuban law. These permitted him to hold trials against potential rivals and troublemakers, like his friend and comrade Huberto Matos, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison. This scared Cuban Democrats to the extent that by autumn 1959 there were no Democrats left in the Cuban government. A few months after his takeover of Cuba, Castro went on a much publicized tour to the USA. Here he had a 3-hour interview with CIA officer Frank Bender, who concluded that Castro was anti-communist. But immediately after his return to Cuba, Castro set up the Agrarian Reform bill. This was very similar to the traditional communist step of land reform, which is basically taking land from its rich owners and giving it to the poor peasants. This happened when communists came to power in Russia in 1917, in China in 1949, and in North Korea in 1950. As in these communist states, Castro wanted the farms to be organized in cooperatives, shared farming, and later to be converted into collectives where everything was shared. In order to organize this, he set up the National Agrarian Reform Institute, or INRA, which became connected to his own rebel army. With a 100,000-man militia, Castro now controlled Cuba directly, deciding what would happen with the farmland. The president of Cuba, Manuel Urrutia, fled the country, and Castro bowed to the wishes of the masses and accepted the presidency. A year later, in 1960, a central planning board was set up to control the economy along with a board for revolutionary propaganda. In December 1961, Castro finally publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist and organized members of the Cuban Communist Party, the Student Directorate, and his own July 26th movement, which was the date of the failed attack of the Moncada barracks in 1953, into a single revolutionary organization. 2 years later, in 1963, this organization, which was controlled completely by Castro, was then transformed into being the official Communist Party of Cuba. Castro's power was now absolute, legalistically, economically, and politically. And a spiritual power vacuum was created by persecuting the Catholic Church. Castro tolerated no competitors for attention. He even outlawed the capitalist Santa Claus in 1959 and tried to replace him with a Cuban Don Feliciano, or Mr. Happiness. As we can see, Castro followed many of the ways of the traditional communist takeovers, although he waited for almost 3 years with announcing himself as being communist. It is still debated whether he truly was communist or simply became one in order to gain trade with and support from the USSR. Castro changed parts of Cuban law, instituted land reforms, and finally merged all influential organizations under himself, only calling it communist after he had secured his own position as undisputed leader. This reminds us of the so-called salami tactics used by the Soviet-controlled communist parties of Eastern Europe in 1945 to 48, who would ally with the agricultural political parties in order to gain influence and then completely replace these with communist ideas once power had been achieved. But Castro's main philosophy was never communist. The main fundament for his political influence and ambitions was that great enemy to the north, capitalist USA. Creating a common enemy for his people against whom they needed protection is quite similar to Hitler's agitation against the Jews in the 1920s and 1930s. After having seen Castro use democratic, revolutionary, and legalistic methods, we approach Castro's political maneuvers on the international arena. His Cuban Revolution caused much upheaval in Cuba's relations to other countries. The Cold War was at its highest, and the two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, both became involved with Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 put Cuba in the center of a possible all-out nuclear war. It began right from Castro's takeover. The USA was not about to accept American companies losing their sugar plantations and factories in Cuba and threatened with a trade embargo. Faced with a loss of trade and loss of import of oil, Castro sent Che Guevara to negotiate with the Soviet Union. In May 1960, the Russians agreed to buy 1 million tons of sugarcane per year for the next 5 years. 20% of it would be paid in US dollars, the rest in goods, one of them Russian oil. In October 1960, American President Eisenhower proposed a trade blockade on Cuba. He also began planning an invasion of Cuba, where Cubans from America would land at the Bay of Pigs to start a counter-revolution against Castro. The invasion, which took place in April 1961, was a huge disaster. Castro knew all about it and captured the 1,189 Cuban invaders. He later sold them for a ransom to the USA for $53 million paid in medicine, and this was when Castro proclaimed himself a Marxist-Leninist. The CIA began Operation Mongoose, a long series of attempts to poison or otherwise assassinate Castro. Castro asked the Soviet Union for nuclear missiles, and when this was discovered by an American spy plane in 1962, new US President Kennedy issued an ultimatum to the Soviet Union. For days, the world held its breath to see whether the USSR would remove its nuclear weapons. They did, and the world avoided a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis consolidated Castro's power both inside and outside Cuba, but the question is why Castro was prepared to go this far to remain in power. Did he approach the Russians out of fear from the USA, because Cuba needed oil and perhaps protection, or did he do so intentionally to position himself as a threat to the much larger USA? This discussion has gone on for 40 years and is unlikely to be resolved. Also, it is impossible to get a clear image of Castro's further foreign policies. From 1959 onwards, Castro continuously supported third world countries in Latin America and Africa in revolutions and shifts of government, both with money, advisors, and soldiers. In conclusion, we see how Fidel Castro tried several tactics in taking power over Cuba. He started within the democratic system, running as a member of Congress, but shifted to a revolutionary tactic when needed. During his trial for treason, Castro, like Hitler, turned the courtroom into a political stage, gaining many followers in the process. When having taken power, Castro used legal means to be able to put the opposition on trial and tactics similar of the salami tactics of Eastern European communists in order to consolidate his power within the government. There has been comparisons between Castro and Hitler, whose political strengths in many ways seem similar. Like Hitler, Castro demonstrated an immense ability as a speaker. Speaking for sometimes up to 16 hours, he would gradually turn the masses of spectators to his side, with the result of them actually chanting their demands, Castro's own proposals, back to him. Castro talked about controlling las masas, and it remained a key feature of his skills as a politician. Another was his secrecy regarding political ideology. In 1959, the CIA categorized Castro as an anti-communist, yet 2 years later, he was a Marxist-Leninist. Finally, there is the question why Castro supported revolutions in other third world countries. Was it to liberate the poor and downtrodden, or was it in the hope of gaining more influence as leader maximo in a third world front, united against Western imperialism and capitalism? This will be the topic of another investigation.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century Histories Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by Los Perdidos. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.